All right, this is lesson 32. We're now talking about numerical expressions. So our goal is I'll be able to interpret and evaluate and solve numerical expressions, including the language of scaling and fraction division. Nice. So we're using what we've been doing the past couple of days and being able to put that either from words to numbers or from numbers to words. All right, so our first problem is we're just going to read it, right? So twice the sum of 3/5 and 1 1/2. Okay, so let's go ahead and just write this out. So how do we write twice numerically, right? That's a 2. Twice means 2. All right. Now it says twice the sum of. All right, so there's our word of. So we're actually trying to figure out what twice of something is. Okay, so what is being multiplied by 2? Well, we have this. All right, we have two numbers. We have 3/5 and we have 1 1/2. But here's our clue here: sum. Okay, from a lot of our other discussions, you should remember that sum means addition. Okay, so we have to add these two fractions together. We have 3/5 plus 1 1/2. Okay, we're not done yet though, because now we have two different operations. We have multiplication and we have addition. Okay, so where does our parentheses go? So is it saying 2 times 3/5 plus 1 1/2, or is it saying 3/5 plus 1/2 times 2? So it's the second one. So we need to solve this part first, and then we multiply it all by 2. Okay? You can write it the other way. You can write it like this and then put times 2 at the end. It'll still give you the same thing because the parentheses will always be solved first, no matter what is in front or behind it. All right? Let's go to this one. So half the sum of 3/5 and 1/12. Or sorry, 1/2. Okay, so let's compare what we just saw and to this one we see now. So we still have the same fractions, 3/5 and 1 1/2. Okay, we still also have sum. Okay, the only thing that has changed is half the sum of. All right, so before we had twice the sum of, now we have half the sum of. So it's going to be just a little bit different. I'm going to go ahead and write 3/5 here. Right, and we're still adding because it's still the sum, 1 1/2. All right, and we have to solve that first, okay? And now we're trying to figure out half. So there's a couple of different ways that we can actually do this. You can multiply by 1/2, right? That's one way, okay? Or you can also, let's pretend, I'm going to show this in blue. Okay, I can have my 3/5 plus 1 1/2 over 2, right? Isn't that dividing it by 2? Dividing by 2 would be half, right? All right, so that's the second way. So we're ignoring this part, okay? So 3/5 plus 1 1/2 over 2, okay? Or another way that we could do this, and let me put this in black, right? So we're ignoring this, you could put divided by 2. All right, so if you notice, I want to take your attention to this. Times 1/2 and dividing by 2 is the same thing. All right, so this is kind of a little rabbit trail, but I think this is good for you guys to know. If I multiply by 1/2, okay, I can also say divided by 2. All right, I want you to keep this information in mind, because when we start to divide by a fraction or divide by a whole number, we'll actually be able to do something in order to multiply it instead of dividing, okay? So I'll pause here with that, and then later on I'll come back to that, okay? So we looked at not just 2 different ways, we looked at 3 different ways. All right, so this one, you're going to go ahead and write this expression on your own. You're going to show me the difference between 3/4 and 1/2 divided by 3. You don't have to solve it. All I want to see is, can you write it out? All right. So let's look at our second problem, okay? I'm not going to read it because we're going to write it down. I'm not actually going to write it because that would be hard with my little writing tool here. So you just have to listen. Okay, so what should we do first, right? So we have our parentheses here. We know if we're going to solve it, we're actually going to solve that part first. Okay, but we can start here or we can start here. I like to start at the front just because that's what we're looking at, all right? So we'll start with 2/5 times, right? Or you could even say 2/5 of, right? We know of means multiplication. You could also say 2/5 multiplied, but maybe not that one. So I'm going to start out with 2/5 times, okay? Now this is where the tricky part comes. A lot of people like to say 2/5 times 1/2 minus 4/10. Well, the problem with that is then you don't know if you're subtracting. So what you would do is 2/5 times 1/2 and 4/10. I don't know how you would even solve that, right? So you're going to actually say, this is the right way to write it, 2/5 times the difference between 1/2 and 4/10. All right? So even before I say my fractions here, I have to say the difference. Okay? The difference is going to tell me, ooh, hey, I have to subtract those two numbers. Okay? So if we were adding, right, we would say the sum of. If we were multiplying, we would say the product of. If we were dividing, we're going to say the quotient of. All right? Those are our 4 different operations. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay? Then I want you, no, we're actually going to do this one together, okay? So we're going to show it I'm going to say it as a numerical expression. Then we're actually going to solve this one, okay? So here we go. Now, if you notice back here, I have my division. It's outside of the parentheses, and it's at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and just start at the beginning. All right, so I have this little guy here, all right? Plus is the sum of. So I'm going to say the sum of 3/4 and 1 25/100 divided by 1/3, right? Does that make sense? Hopefully it does, okay? Divided by 1/3, all right? So our numerical expression, that's what it is. The sum of 3/4 and 1 25/100 divided by 1/3. Okay? Now, remember what I talked about on the last couple of slides, right? This divided by 1/3. Okay, actually, let me go back to it. Here it's divided by 2, but I can switch it and make it multiplied by 1/2. So what did I do? I was actually looking at this, right? I know that 2, any whole number, is 2 over, or that number over 1. Okay, so I'm actually looking at that. So if I want to multiply it, guess what I did? I just switched it. Okay, this is called the reciprocal. That's just a very fancy word for flipping it. If I flip it, then I have to go to the opposite operation. So if I had multiplied by 1/2, let's find the reciprocal, and I would have to divide by 2, which is flipped because it's 2 over 1, but 2 over 1 is 2. Okay, so then actually, no, wrong one. So then what I can actually look at here is multiplied by 3, right? So I've divided by 1/3, and I'm going to flip it, which would make it 3 over 1. And because I flipped it, I have to do the opposite, and I'd get 3 over 1, which is the same as multiplied by 3. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and solve this. I'll solve it both ways, using the division of 1/3, and I'll solve it using the multiplication of 3, and we'll see if we get the same thing, all right? So let's go ahead and solve this. So real quick, I'm going to actually turn 3/4 into a decimal, okay? So we should know that 3/4 is the same as 75/100. If you don't believe me, you can do the math. All right. So I'm going to go ahead add 75/100 plus 1 25/100. Now, why am I doing that first? Well, because the parentheses. Parentheses say me first. All right. So if I add those two, what is 75 plus 25? That's 1. If you think about American money, the quarters. All right, so 1, and then I already have a whole here, so I actually have 2. Right, so 3/4 plus 1 25 hundredths is 2. All right, so here we go. I can divide by 1/3. Okay, or, and I'm going to write the second one up here, 2 times 3. All right, so no, thinking back onto our whole numbers divided by a fraction, right? So we can look at our tape diagram here just to make sure, and we all know I'm not just making up answers here, right? There's my whole, my 2 wholes, and I'm going to divide each by 1/3, right? All right, so how many do I have? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts. All right, so my answer is 6. The way I like to remember this is if I start with a whole number, my answer is going to be a whole number. If I start with a fraction, my answer will be a fraction. But here's another way to think about it. I took divided by 1/3 and I flipped it. I made the reciprocal. All right, so 1/3, I switched it. Now it's 3/1, which is still the same as 3. And because I flipped it, I have to change my division sign to the opposite, which is multiplication. And wait, what is 2 times 3? It is 6. Look at that. All right, it's the same thing. Okay, so this is a good thing to remember. Okay, I know some of you have already learned this trick, but it's not necessarily a trick because it makes sense. All right, but this is why. Okay, so I want you, you're going to do, I'm not going to read it, because what I'll have you guys do is write it in words, and then I'll ask you to go ahead and solve it. All right, good luck